I woke up to the sound of fists hammering on my iron gate and a voice barking through a megaphone that the HOA was seizing my lake house immediately and that I had 10 minutes to vacate before security forced entry, and as absurd as it sounded, there stood Karen at the head of 2 pickup trucks full of hired guards, clipboard in hand, sunglasses gleaming, shouting that my property was now community space. That was my hook into the madness, and I can still remember standing barefoot on the porch thinking how ridiculous it all was, because when I bought this house years ago, it was supposed to be my quiet refuge, my inheritance of peace after decades of hard work. My father had brought me to this lake as a child to fish. My mother had sat on the porch drinking coffee while the fog rolled off the water, and when they passed, I saved every penny to secure this place so it wouldn't slip into the hands of developers who saw nothing but dollar signs. The irony that Karen thought she could bully me out of it with a clipboard and a couple of hired guards was almost comical, but the high stakes were already clear. She had gone from letters and gossip to a full public stunt at my gate, and I knew this was not just harassment, this was theft in broad daylight. Still, even in that tense moment I couldn't help but smirk because what she didn't know was that I had friends who rode heavy iron, friends who never backed down from intimidation, and the roar of their engines was only a phone call away. I should explain why I came here in the first place, why I traded city life for the lake. Years of corporate grind had worn me thin, and I wanted somewhere quiet to breathe. The lake house wasn't just a property, it was a chapter of my family story, with beams soaked with memory, a dock weathered by my father's boots, walls that still smelled faintly of the cedar he'd used to patch them. When I arrived that first summer after retirement, I thought I had found the silence I crave. Dawn broke with nothing but birdsong and the slap of fish against the water. I would park my Harley under the pines and watch mist lift off the lake. It was supposed to be mine, earned, paid for, protected by law. But Karen, the self-declared queen of the HOA, saw it differently. She drove a pearl-white SUV, always spotless, always parked diagonally across 2 spots at the community center. Her clipboard was never far from her manicured hands, and she wielded it like a weapon, slapping fines and notices on every neighbor she disliked. I had heard stories even before I moved in, warnings whispered at the general store, but I thought if I minded my own business she'd leave me alone. That illusion shattered the first week when she marched up my drive uninvited, heels crunching gravel, announcing that my dock was an unapproved structure and would need to be removed to meet community standards. I simply told her the truth, that my dock was older than the HOA charter, predating her rule by decades, but she smirked and said, "The HOA decides what's best for the community, and your personal feelings don't matter." From that moment I knew peace here was going to be contested, but I held my ground. Every morning I tried to remind myself this land was mine, not theirs. I fished, I rode, I repaired the roof with my own hand. But Karen escalated. First came the fines for imaginary violations, then the letters claiming my motorcycles were nuisance vehicles, as though the occasional sound of an engine was more offensive than her own parties that dragged past midnight. Then came the veiled threat. HOA security in their cheap uniforms loitered near my gate, snapping photos, whispering into radios. They once left a note taped to my porch claiming they could shut off my power for noncompliance. I laughed at that one, because my house ran on its own generator and solar panels, another inheritance from my father's stubborn independence. Still, the pressure was constant, a steady drip meant to wear me down. The breaking point for me was not just the harassment, but the sheer arrogance of her words. One evening I confronted her after finding yet another paper stuffed in my mailbox. She was strutting down the road with that smug look, and I asked directly, "Why are you really doing this?" She didn't even hesitate. She tilted her sunglasses down, stared me in the eye and said, "Because a house with this kind of view shouldn't be wasted on just one man. This lakefront could be our community's showcase, the crown jewel of our event. You're just a placeholder." Imagine someone telling you that your memories, your family, your sweat and savings were just obstacles to her vision of cocktail parties and photo op. I walked back inside that night and stared at the walls, remembering my father's handprints in the wood, and I swore she would not take it from me. At first I tried the proper channels. I went to the county clerk with my deed, a thick packet proving my land was exempt from HOA jurisdiction. The clerk nodded sympathetically and confirmed it in plain words. They have no legal claim here. I thought that would end it. I even showed Karen the paperwork. She flipped through it, scoffed, and said, "Paper doesn't stop progress." That was her favorite word, progress. She loved to talk about her vision, her prestige, her belief that she was building a better community. What she was really building was her ego, brick by brick, and I had the misfortune of owning the prize lot she wanted to claim. The community itself was divided. Some laughed at her antics, others whispered their support out of fear. Old Frank, the fisherman who lived down the way, told me over a beer at the store, "She's been circling this place since you moved in. Don't give her an inch." The sheriff played neutral, advising me to document everything but careful not to take sides. The store owner shook his head and muttered, "She wants to host galas here, boost the HOA's prestige, flip the value of every house by waving your lake view like a trophy." And an investor friend warned me flat out, "If she forces you out, she'll resell this place under HOA control and triple her influence. She's not after rules, she's after power." I held on to those warnings, each one like a nail hammered into the coffin of patience. And yet, standing there at dawn that morning as she bellowed through her megaphone, I didn't panic. My pulse slowed, my mind steadied. This was not the end of the fight. This was the beginning of her downfall. Because if she thought a few guards and a clipboard could intimidate me, she had no idea what kind of steel and leather loyalty I had waiting on call. She had crossed into my domain, and soon enough, the engines would roar, the ground would shake, and the community would see who truly stood their ground at the lake. After that morning when Karen tried to seize my lake house with her guards and her megaphone, she didn't back off, she only changed tactics, and that is when the paper war began. Thin envelopes slid into my mailbox with the HOA's seal stamped on them, each one a petty declaration of some invented violation. The first was a fine for unapproved landscaping because the pines in my yard had grown irregular. I laughed when I read it, because those pines had stood there for 50 years before the HOA even existed, but still she sent a bill for $500 as though she could rewrite nature itself. The next week came another notice, this time claiming my dock was unsafe and must be removed within 30 days. That dock had been built by my father and reinforced by me, thick cedar beams sunk deep into the mud, strong enough to outlast storms that had torn down newer docks around the lake, but to Karen it was just another excuse to wedge her authority into my property. I wrote polite responses at first, each one attaching copies of my deed and county exemptions, but I might as well have been tossing stones into the lake, because she either ignored them or twisted my words into more accusations. Then came the so-called noise violations, which were really aimed at my Harleys. I kept 2 of them under the pines, both tuned and polished, and sometimes on evenings when the sun dipped low, I'd rev them just to feel that vibration echo off the water. It wasn't every day, it wasn't late at night, but Karen sent a notice claiming repeated engine disturbances. I knew what she was really doing, laying the groundwork to call my motorcycles a nuisance so she could push for their banishment, and by extension push me out. HOA security even parked outside my gate, pretending to monitor decibel levels, holding up little plastic devices that beeped but meant nothing. I confronted them one afternoon asking, "Do you even know the law?" And they just muttered, "We're following orders." Karen drove by slowly that day, rolled down her window, and said with her syrupy smugness, "We'll have this settled soon enough, don't worry." I thought maybe showing her the hard facts would shut it down, so I made a trip into town and sat down with the county clerk, laying out my deed, the original plats, the legal line that separated my house from the HOA entirely. The clerk leaned back, tapped the paper, and said, "They've got no jurisdiction here, not a shred. If they keep pressing, call the sheriff." That gave me some comfort, But I knew Karen didn't care about what was written in legal ink. She cared about spectacle, and she wanted the neighbors to see me as the stubborn holdout against her grand vision. Sure enough, when I walked back to my truck, I overheard two locals at the cafe whispering that Karen had plans to host exclusive events on my property once it was brought under HOA control, wine tastings, lakefront galas, maybe even renting it out for weddings. She wasn't just trying to bully me for rules, she was scheming to profit off the very land I had fought to keep in my family. It wasn't just gossip either, because the community itself was splitting under her campaign. Old Frank, the fisherman down the road, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "She's circling like a hawk. Everyone knows it. Don't give her an inch, or she'll take the whole shore." He had a point, and his voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen neighbors lose property battles before. The sheriff stayed neutral, though, reminding me to document everything but refusing to intervene until something physical happened. He said, "Don't escalate. Keep your head down. Let her show her hand first." Easier said than done when you're the one with notices piling up on your kitchen table. The local store owner, a wiry man who'd lived through every HOA drama in the valley, leaned across his counter and whispered, "She wants prestige. She thinks if she can claim your land, it'll drive up everyone's values and make her queen of the neighborhood." An investor friend of mine, who had seen similar fights in other towns, gave me the blunt truth over a beer. "If she pushes you out, she'll resell this place under HOA authority, and she'll pocket influence that triples her control. You're standing in the way of her empire." By then the stakes were clear, and every walk down the gravel road confirmed it. Some neighbors would look at me with sympathy, offering a nod or a quick word of support, but others avoided eye contact, afraid to be seen siding with me. Karen had built herself into a power figure, speaking at HOA meetings like a politician, promising improvements and progress, while using me as the example of a selfish outsider blocking the community's future. She even started dropping her favorite phrase whenever we crossed paths: "This lakefront could be our crown jewel." She said it like a mantra, like my house was already a public stage, just waiting for her ribbon cutting. The tension only escalated when her crews started trespassing. One morning I caught two men with clipboards walking my property line, measuring as though they were surveying for construction. I shouted from the porch, "You're trespassing," and one of them had the gall to reply, "HOA authorization." I snapped back, "My deed outranks your clipboard." They shuffled away, muttering that they'd be back with proper clearance. Sure enough, the next week I found surveyor flags staked into the grass near my dock, bright orange markers fluttering like warnings. I yanked them out and tossed them into the fire pit, but the message was clear. Karen was preparing something bigger, something she would unveil not just to intimidate me, but to showcase her power to the whole neighborhood. Through it all, I kept my composure outwardly, but inside I was taking notes, storing each slight, each trespass, each smug remark. It wasn't just about annoyance anymore, it was about dignity. This property was my legacy, my father's sweat carved into every beam, my mother's laughter echoing in the walls, my own years of saving and fighting to hold it. Karen treated it like a stage set for her ego. I could feel the community gossip thickening, the way people paused their conversations when I walked by, the way phones came out when Karen strutted with her entourage. They wanted a show, and she was giving them one. What they didn't know was that I was preparing for a show of my own, one with an ending she wouldn't see coming. The more she pushed, the more patient I became, because I understood something she didn't. Spectacle fades quickly when there's no substance to back it. She could parade her guards, flood me with paper, and plant her surveyor flags, but in the end, the law and the truth were on my side. And beyond the law, I had something else, something she couldn't bully or buy, a brotherhood of riders who had stood with me through tougher battles than an HOA skirmish. Karen might have the spotlight now, but I knew the roar of engines carries farther than any megaphone. The chorus of neighbors, the whispers of gossip, the sidelong glances in town, all of it was just fuel for what was coming, because the higher she built her tower of arrogance, the harder it would fall when the ground shook beneath it. The morning she crossed the line started with the sound of engines that didn't belong to me, a convoy of HOA trucks rumbling up the road like they were preparing for a parade. I walked out to the porch and saw them in formation, white pickups with the HOA logo slapped on the side, men in cheap uniforms carrying clipboards and bolt cutters, and in the lead was Karen in her pearl-white SUV, sunglasses flashing, her hair fixed like she was attending a gala. She stepped out with a ribbon in one hand and a pair of golden scissors in the other, smiling wide as photographers climbed out of the trucks behind her. I leaned against the railing, coffee cup in hand, and just watched as her guards cut the chain off my gate in full daylight, letting the convoy pour into my driveway as though they owned the place. Karen strutted to the front yard, turned toward her little crowd of cameras, and announced, "This lakefront is no longer wasted on selfish individuals, it is now the community's premier asset." She actually said it like she was unveiling a new park, as if my house, my dock, and my history were decorations for her vanity. Neighbors began to gather on the road, drawn by the noise, some filming with their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I caught Frank's eye from down the way, his head shaking slowly, a beer in his hand even though it was barely past breakfast. Karen held her scissors up like a queen about to christen a ship, and I had to bite down my anger, because I realized she wasn't doing this for me, she was doing it for them, the crowd, the board members in suits standing beside her, the HOA foot soldiers lined up behind the trucks. She wanted a public spectacle, a ribbon cutting that made it look like she had won. I could hear her voice booming, talking about progress and vision, about how this lakefront would be transformed into something everyone could enjoy, cocktail parties, community galas, family events. The words rolled off her tongue like rehearsed speeches, and her board members clapped on cue, as if they were in some staged commercial. That was the turning point, because it was no longer just letters and trespasses, it was open theft dressed up as celebration, and I knew in that moment she wasn't going to stop until someone stopped her. I let her finish her little speech, let her cut the ribbon across my gate with a flash of cameras clicking, because patience was now my sharpest weapon. My hands didn't tremble, my voice didn't rise, I simply turned back into the house, shut the door, and sat at the table with my coffee cooling beside me. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the line crossed so boldly that even the sheriff couldn't call it a gray area anymore. They had broken into my land, staged a fraudulent ceremony, declared my home community property in front of cameras. It was absurd, but absurdity only made their downfall more certain, because arrogance blinds people, and Karen was blinded by her own reflection in the camera lenses. That night, when the trucks were gone and the road was quiet again, I laid out my plan. The first step was reinforcement, because I knew they would be back, and next time they would try harder. I upgraded the locks on my gates, installing reinforced chains and steel plates that would take more than bolt cutters to snap. I set up motion sensors hidden in the trees, cameras wired to a secure feed so I'd have every angle recorded. If they thought they could slip in without leaving evidence, they were wrong. Every trespass from now on would be caught, documented, undeniable. The second step was paperwork. I pulled out the thick folder that held my deed, the original plat signed before the HOA even existed, and I added to it copies of every bogus fine, every trespass notice, every photo of Karen's trucks on my land. It grew into a file thick enough to make a lawyer smile. I knew the law was on my side, but I also knew Karen thrived on spectacle, so the real victory would come when I could combine the cold ink of legality with the public weight of humiliation. I called an old friend, a lawyer who had helped me once before, and told him what was happening. He chuckled when I described the ribbon cutting, then said, "Document everything, keep calm, and when the time is right, we'll bring the hammer down." But the third step, the one Karen never saw coming, was the phone call I made to my brothers and sisters on two wheels. My Harley club wasn't just a hobby, it was a family forged over years of rides, rallies, and road trips across every stretch of asphalt this country has to offer. These were people who stood by me when storms hit, who rode through nights and states just to have each other's backs. They weren't violent thugs like Karen would later try to claim, they were men and women with jobs, families, and iron loyalty, and when I told them the HOA was trying to seize my home, their answer was simple. When do you need us? I didn't give them the details yet, didn't need to. I only said soon, and they promised the roar of engines would be ready at my call. In the days that followed, Karen strutted around town like she had already won. I saw her in the store bragging to a group of neighbors, claiming the county was, in full support of the HOA's new community property initiative. She smiled like a politician, handed out glossy flyers with pictures of lakeside parties, and told anyone who would listen that my land was just the beginning of a brighter future. I stood quietly in the corner, listening, watching the way people's faces shifted, some impressed, others skeptical, all of them pulled into her web of half-truths. Frank leaned over to me once and whispered, "She's digging her own grave, just give her rope." I nodded, because he was right. Every time Karen drove by my gate now, she slowed down just enough to make eye contact, as though daring me to fight back. She didn't know that every glance, every smirk, every trespass was another stone in the wall I was building against her. My cameras caught her guards loitering at the gate, my sensors picked up their movements, my lawyers stacked the evidence higher, and my Harley club was only waiting for the signal. Karen thought she was orchestrating a play where I was the villain, but what she didn't realize was that I had already written the final act, and she was walking blindly into it. I spent evenings on the porch, the lake calm, the air heavy with the smell of pine, and I could almost hear the engines already, the thunder of chrome and steel echoing across the water. It wasn't just about scaring her or proving a point, it was about restoring balance, about showing the community that arrogance has consequences and that legacy cannot be bullied away. Karen's ribbon cutting had been her moment of triumph, but in truth it was the flare that signaled the countdown to her downfall. She had turned my home into a stage, and soon enough, the real show would begin, and she would have no idea how quickly the audience would turn against her when the roar of loyalty drowned out the smugness of her speeches. The day of reckoning came sooner than even I expected because Karen couldn't resist pushing the spectacle further, and at sunrise one Saturday the thump of boots and the slam of car doors pulled me from my bed. I looked out and saw HOA security lined up at my gate again, only this time they weren't alone. Karen stood there in a bright red jacket like she was commanding an army, her SUV parked sideways across the road, and behind her were more trucks, more cameras, even a few neighbors who had come to watch. She shouted through her megaphone that the HOA board had voted unanimously to seize my home officially and that I had until the end of the hour to vacate or face charges of trespassing on community property. The irony of being called a trespasser on land I had lived on for decades was laughable, but the tone in her voice wasn't comedy, it was hunger. She believed this was the finale, the moment she crushed the last resistance. I stepped onto the porch calmly, coffee mug in hand, and said only 6 words loud enough for them to hear. "By whose authority do you stand?" Karen smirked, lifted her clipboard, and replied, "The HOA decides and we enforce. You are done here." That was her mistake, because at that exact moment the distant growl I had been waiting for rolled over the hills, faint at first, then swelling until the ground itself trembled. Engines, heavy and deep, cut through the morning air, and every head on that road turned in unison as the sound grew louder. Around the bend came the first Harley, chrome catching the light, then another, then a dozen more, each one thunder rolling in behind the last. My brothers and sisters rode in 2 lines tight as rails, leather jackets crested with patches that spoke louder than any HOA badge. The convoy poured onto the road, the engines reverberating off the trees, and the smug expressions on Karen's security team drained into pale confusion. Karen herself stepped back, sunglasses slipping slightly as she stammered, What is this?" I didn't answer her right away. I just let the roar settle around us, let the sight of all that steel and loyalty burn itself into the crowd's memory. When the riders cut their engines, silence fell heavy, broken only by birds startled into flight, and I said quietly, "That's my community." The sheriff arrived minutes later, pulled by the noise, his cruiser lights flashing as he parked down the road. He stepped out with his hat tilted against the sun and looked over the scene. Karen's guards clutching their clipboards, my riders lined shoulder to shoulder, neighbors holding up phones to record. The sheriff walked to me first, tipped his hat, and asked, "You got your paperwork?" I handed him the thick folder I had prepared, and he leafed through it with the patience of a man who knew this was the final straw. He glanced at Karen and said flatly, "You've got no jurisdiction here. This deed predates your entire association. What you're doing right now is trespassing." The crowd murmured, some gasping, others laughing nervously. Karen tried to recover, raising her voice. "This man is obstructing progress. He's threatening us with bikers. This is illegal intimidation." The sheriff held up a hand to silence her and said, "The only intimidation I see is your crew cutting his locks, staging ceremonies on his lawn, and claiming land that isn't yours. He has every right to call his friends here." That was when the laughter started, soft at first from Frank down the road, then rolling through the crowd as phones tilted higher, catching every angle. Karen's red jacket suddenly looked like a costume, her golden clipboard a toy, and she could feel it. She sputtered, pointing at me, then at the riders, trying to summon her old confidence, but it was gone. I stepped down from the porch, walked to the middle of the road where everyone could see me, and said calmly, "You wanted community property? Congratulations, the whole community's watching you run." It was the meme-worthy line that broke the dam. Phones clicked, cameras rolled, and laughter burst out as Karen's own guards began retreating, shaking their heads, some even climbing back into their truck. Karen's face twisted red behind her sunglasses, and in a last desperate attempt she shouted, "This isn't over, I'll have you all fined, I'll bring the county on you." The sheriff just tucked the deed folder under his arm and said, "You already brought the county, and we're done here." Karen tried to stand her ground, but the board members in suits who had once clapped for her were now whispering among themselves, backing away, worried about their own names being tied to her stunt. One of them muttered loud enough to be heard, "She told us the county approved this." Another replied, "She lied, we're finished." The riders, silent but steady, stared her down until she finally snapped, turned on her heel, and stormed back to her SUV. Cameras followed her, neighbors chuckled, and the sound of her door slamming shut was drowned out by laughter and the first pings of videos being uploaded. Within hours the phrase, "Karen vs. Harley Gang," was already spreading around town. The fallout was swift. Karen's own HOA board held an emergency meeting to distance themselves, stripping her of authority and quietly apologizing to the community. The lawsuits came next: trespass, property damage, defamation, each one stacked neatly by my lawyer and filed with a smile. Her reputation crumbled faster than her speeches had once inflated it. Neighbors who had once feared her now laughed openly, some even sending me the memes that spread on local social media, clips of her waving her golden scissors spliced against the roar of Harley engines, captioned "Progress Denied." Even the store owner who once whispered gossip now laughed across the counter, saying, "You didn't just stop her, you made her the punchline." As the dust settled, I found myself back on the porch, the lake quiet again, the smell of pine in the air. My riders stayed a while, sharing coffee and stories, the thunder of their engines replaced by the soft hum of friendship. Frank dropped by too, shaking his head and grinning. "I told you, give her rope." She tied her own noose. The sheriff stopped one last time before leaving, tipping his hat and saying, "You did it right. Calm, patient, by the book." She never stood a chance. That was when I realized the real lesson wasn't just about fighting back, it was about holding your ground with dignity, about letting arrogance expose itself and crumble under its own weight. I thought about my father's hands building the dock, my mother's laughter rolling across the porch, the years I spent saving every penny to make this house mine. Karen saw it as property to exploit, but I knew better. Land isn't just soil and wood, it's memory, legacy, respect. And respect cannot be seized with a clipboard or a megaphone, it has to be earned. That was the truth she never understood, and that's why she fell. So now I ask you, as you listen to this story, have you ever faced a Karen or an HOA that tried to claim what was yours, that tried to bully you into surrendering your dignity? If you have, tell me in the comments how you handled it. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, because there will always be more tales of arrogance undone and communities standing strong.